Ever get that feeling like you've totally misread a situation?
Oh, yeah.
Like you thought someone was doing great, but actually they were struggling with something really tough?
Yeah, I've been there.
That disconnect, right?
Totally.
That's where empathy comes in, or doesn't, and that's what we're diving into today with Kathy Stringer's work.
Hmm.
Cops cop out on empathy. We're going way beyond simple definitions to understand how empathy really works, especially in high-stakes fields like law enforcement.
Right, because it's so crucial there.
Exactly. We're going to unpack why it matters so much in those professions, how it can be both, get this, weaponized and neglected, and the huge impact when it's just absent.
Interesting.
And Stringer knows this world firsthand. She saw the power of empathy and what happens when it's missing, which led her to write this piece. So let's start basic. What is empathy? One definition we found from Infopedia calls it imaginative projection.
Sounds kind of like a superpower, right?
Right.
Imaginative projection, in this context, it's really about trying to step into someone else's emotional shoes. We use our own experiences, how we understand emotions, to try and get what someone else is going through.
Okay, so it's not literally becoming them,
Right.
but using our own internal map to try and understand theirs.
Exactly. And there's this other definition we should look at. It's from Lauren Wisbeth, and she describes empathy as the self as a vehicle for understanding,
Interesting.
which I think is really insightful, right? We're not erasing ourselves, but our experiences, our emotions, they're like a bridge to connect to someone else's reality.
It's like trying to understand what it's like to be a chef. I might not have their skills, but I can tap into my own love of cooking, memories of amazing meals, to get what drives them.
Exactly. And just like any skill, the more you use it, the sharper it gets. Now imagine this understanding, or lack of it, in law enforcement. A profession built on human interaction, often under intense pressure.
And that's where Stringer's work gets so compelling. She doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. Like during the Nuremberg trials after World War II, a U.S. Army psychiatrist, Captain Gilbert, he noticed this chilling thing among the Nazi war criminals, a profound lack of empathy. They just couldn't or wouldn't connect to the suffering of other human beings.
Wow, that's a tough one to process.
It really is, and it makes you wonder, can empathy even be taught? Especially in professions like law enforcement where it's so needed.
It's a question people have been grappling with for a long time, especially after tragedies like the Holocaust. There's been, and still is, this massive push for empathy training, especially for those in positions of power.
It reminds me of this thing I find fascinating, almost like simulating empathy. You know that show, The Pretender?
Yeah.
The main character, Jared, he uses these super detailed simulations to get inside people's heads, predict their behavior.
And what's at the heart of those simulations? Empathy. He's drawing on psychology, observation, his own life, to accurately model what's going on in someone else's mind.
So are we all capable of these simulations, even on a smaller scale? Like if I'm disagreeing with a coworker, could I use some kind of empathy simulation to see their point of view?
Totally. Every time we try to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, imagine their reasons, their feelings, we're doing a kind of empathy simulation. The more we do it, the better we understand those around us.
So we've been talking about empathy as this powerful tool, right, to
Oh.
understand each other.
Yeah.
But it's not always simple, is it?
Right.
Stringer brings up this whole empathy versus truth thing, got me thinking, can you actually be empathetic and be objective at the same time?
Ooh, that's a good one. And I think it gets to how we even define empathy. One perspective Stringer brings up is Dr. Vaknin, and he suggests, get this, empathy might be more of a conditioned response.
Really?
Yeah, almost like a reflex, more than some purely altruistic act.
A reflex, like it's not always a choice we're making.
Well, Vaknin argues when we see someone else in pain, our initial empathy, it's often rooted in our own past. It's like seeing someone stub their toe and we wince because we remember that pain.
Okay, yeah, I get that. But if our empathy is shaped by our own history, doesn't that make it, well, kind of biased?
Exactly, that's the point. Are we truly empathizing with their experience or with our own memory of something similar? And if that's the case, can we ever separate our own stuff, our emotions, biases, from really getting someone else's reality?
And it gets even trickier, because Vaknin says without empathy, we'd basically be all about self-preservation, like stuck in that survival of the fittest mode.
Right. He's saying empathy is key for how our societies work, our morals, everything. It's that ability to connect to someone else's humanity, even when they're different, that allows for, working together, compassion, ultimately a better world.
So it's not just about feeling empathy, it's about what we do with it.
Yeah.
how it affects how we act, how we treat people.
Exactly. Think of it like this. A good salesperson, right? They might use empathy to get what a customer needs, their pain points, then offer a solution that truly helps.
Okay, I see where you're going with this, but couldn't that same understanding be used for, well, not so good things too?
Absolutely. That's the thing about empathy. It's powerful. In the wrong hands, it's manipulation, right? Imagine that salesperson, instead of helping, they use that knowledge to pressure you, guilt you, make you buy something you can't afford.
Wow, that's a powerful example. It's like empathy without ethics is maybe as bad as no empathy at all.
Exactly, which is why self-awareness is huge. We got to check our own biases, why we're feeling empathetic. Are we truly connecting or trying to control?
And that makes me think about the limits of empathy. Even if we mean well, can we ever fully step into someone else's shoes? Especially when their background, their experiences are so different from ours.
Such a good point. And Stringer emphasizes this throughout the book. Our ability to empathize, it's always seen through our own lens, right? Our personal histories, our culture, our own emotional baggage.
Which leads us right to Stringer's main focus.
Mm-hmm.
First responders, law enforcement, these are the people dealing with incredibly intense situations all the time. A
Absolutely.
worst of human suffering, day in, day out. It's got to take a toll, like wear down those empathy muscles.
Exactly. And that's where compassion fatigue comes in, something Stringer talks about a lot. Imagine seeing trauma, violence, grief constantly.
Yeah.
Your brain's going to start building walls,
That's
right,
right.
just to cope.
You almost have to, or get totally overwhelmed by all these heavy emotions.
Right. But those walls, they protect you, but they also get in the way of the empathy you need in those jobs.
And Stringer says this so well. She quotes someone who's lived it. Protective agencies may find it difficult to flip the empathy switch from one dispatch call to the next. It's kind of heartbreaking, but it makes sense.
It does, and it shows the dilemma here. When people in those helping professions, protecting, serving, when they struggle with empathy, it can accidentally cause harm.
Because even if it's not on purpose, that lack of empathy, it comes across wrong, right? Like indifference or worse, judgment, especially when someone's already vulnerable.
Absolutely. And this goes back to Stringer's point. We got to reframe this. Empathy isn't weak. It's not something to suppress. It's a tool, a skill, and it needs practice, especially in these tough jobs.
And Stringer's great. She doesn't just point out problems. Like she talks about training, right?
Mhm.
Giving first responders the space to deal with their own trauma, build up those empathy reserves, basically.
And knowing yourself is key there. Stringer brings up Susan Senstad, who says vulnerability is huge for ethical behavior, for genuinely care. It's being okay with our own limits, our own humanity, that lets us connect more deeply with others.
Which makes me think of this trauma of treatment thing Stringer talks about.
Yeah.
It's weird, but sometimes how you're treated after something awful, it can be as bad as the event itself.
Exactly. She has this powerful story, a cop responding to an attempted suicide. The person was clearly extremely vulnerable, but the cop, he was cold, almost mean. It shows how much damage a lack of empathy can do, especially right when someone needs compassion most.
It reminds you, empathy isn't just being nice. It's seeing the humanity in every interaction even, or maybe especially, when it's tough to find.
Yes, and Stringer wants us to take a broader approach within these agencies. Education, open conversations, chances for first responders to actually connect with the people they serve, breaking down that us versus them, building real understanding.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into empathy, I think Stringer leaves us with this. Empathy isn't finite. It's not something you run out of. It's like a muscle. It gets stronger when you use it. And by growing our ability on empathy, being aware of other people's experiences, we can create a more compassionate, understanding world, one moment, one interaction at a time.